In today's episode, as we progress through the maze of parables Jesus taught, we pause for thought over the consequences which the last 5 parables provided us with. We have grouped them into a theme known as the parables of separation, as they all involve the clear demarcation made between Judaism and what Jesus was bringing to the table for Christianity. Let's explore how these parables have led to some really strange teachings from the pits of hell. In the parable of the friends of the bridegroom, we obtain the first clue of this separation. Jesus and his disciples were not following Jewish self-imposed traditions requiring them to fast on a regular basis. This separation became more apparent when we consider the parable of patching a garment and placing new wine in old wineskins. In both cases, Jesus revealed that he was not attempting to rectify the legalism which had crept into Judaism, but was offering something completely new. The other 2 parables, the parable of the wicked vinedressers and the barren fig tree, both illustrated that this separation would come at a great price. It also dealt with Judaism rejecting the offer of salvation by Jesus, which resulted in their demise. And specifically, with the vinedressers, it is revealed that the religious leaders knew full well that Jesus was the Messiah, but since he did not bring them honor, they deliberately chose to reject him. They had reasoned that they held the power, and God could do nothing without them. This blatant rejection of God's grace brought judgment upon them. In 70 AD, almost 4 decades after the crucifixion of Jesus, Jerusalem was ransacked and the Jewish race was scattered throughout the world. While through these parables Jesus distinguished his teachings from that of the religious system, Christianity from Judaism, and grace from law, this separation does not mean rejection. Even with the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, this does not imply that all Jews will be eternally damned. However, some churches teach that these parables, along with some teachings of Jesus, prove that Jesus is done with Judaism and the Jewish race. This teaching is called replacement theology, or also known by another technical name, supersessionism. They believe, with the Jews rejecting Jesus, that God has changed his mind and no longer recognizes Jews as his chosen people, nor has a future plan for them. Advocates of this view spiritualize the blessings awarded to Israel and apply it to the church, while ignoring the curses or associating them with Israel, leaving all the glory for the church. This convenient false teaching has become embedded with many of our churches. Now, one can certainly understand why some leading mentors in Christian history have fallen into this trap. They were living in times when Jerusalem and the Jewish race was desolate. Justin Martyr is one of the first known to believe that the church as a collective body had replaced Israel. He was a well-respected theologian and still is to this day, yet he referred to the church as true spiritual Israel. This was followed by the teachings of Hippolytus of Rome, who taught that the darkness prophesied by Jesus concerning the Jews was not temporary, but rather of an everlasting nature. Likewise, Augustine, who was responsible for the massive spiritualization of Scripture, although well respected in his day, echoed much of what was said by his predecessors. And almost a millennium later, Martin Luther described God's judgment upon the Jewish race as being so severe that there was no doubt that God had rejected them and is no longer willing to be their God. Unfortunately, since these men were well respected, their views have become part of the outlook of many Christian congregations, and the list of adherents goes on. However, we are probably the most privileged generation in our ability to understand scriptures. Most of us in the Western world have access to not only Bibles and awesome teachers, but also have a history readily available at our fingertips. Unlike any generation, we can reference and learn from each other and our forefathers in rapid time. Yet certain churches are so entrenched in their doctrine and history that they see no need to question their thinking. Currently, the following sects, or even churches in Christianity, subscribe to this doctrine of replacement theology: the Roman Catholic Church, the United Methodist Church, the Lutheran Church, the Presbyterian Church of the USA, as well as the sects of Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses. Of course, every believer throughout the New Testament was called to question the teachings of others. The parables alone indicate that there was a separation between Judaism and Christianity, in other words, the church and Israel, but affirms that there is no rejection of the Jewish race. Particularly in the parable of the old and new wineskins, both are described as being preserved, even though the one would ultimately tear, resulting in wine being spilt. Now, when we consider the other teachings in the Bible, it rather confirms that these famous, well-respected teachers were in grave error. Let's explore why Israel and the Jewish race remains important for every believer. A core element of the prophetic words of both the Old and the New Testaments relates to the covenant established by God with the Jewish forefathers. Abraham was selected by God and given an everlasting promise of inheriting the land of Canaan, which would be granted to all his descendants. God communicated the same covenant to Abraham's son Isaac, who was the elected son to receive these promises. Isaac in turn had two children, Jacob and Esau, where Jacob was given the same covenant promise. Jacob would later have his name changed to Israel, and he became the father of 12 sons, who form the 12 tribes of Israel. As a sign that they were entitled to the benefit of God's covenant, all Jewish boys from the time of Abraham to date are circumcised. Through this covenant, God had established a nation that he called mine elect, the Jewish nation, and they were promised the land of Canaan as their eternal inheritance. Now, this covenant promise was unconditional, and this alone speaks against the theology that God is against the Jews. The prophets of Judaism are not quiet on this issue either. The book of Daniel and Ezekiel provide prophecies which directly affect the Jews, the world, and their relationship to God. In fact, the Old Testament prophets predicted that the Jews would return to their homeland and will be there at a time when God establishes his eternal kingdom on the earth. When we read the New Testament Olivet Discourse by Jesus, the Jews are key in the signs which leads to the return of Christ. God has a program to restore the Jews into his fold, and an unconditional covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which is now Israel, as recorded in the book of Genesis. It is only for this reason why the Jews as a nation still exist to this day. In our New Testament, Paul reveals that once the time of the Gentiles has come to an end, God will return to bring the Jews back into his fold. Paul asks the same question, asked rhetorically: did God reject his people? He answered this, by no means, emphasizing that God did not reject his people, whom he foreknew. A few verses later, he asked the same question in a different way. Did they stumble beyond recovery? Only to answer the question with, not at all, and then provides a reason for their stumbling. Salvation has come to the Gentiles to make Israel envious. Now, the entire chapter in Romans explicitly deals with the relationship between the church and the nation of Israel, and even proves that there will be a harvest of the church before the Jews themselves will receive salvation. To answer the question previously raised, is there a possibility that God could have changed his mind? Paul implicitly gives another not at all, and reminds us that God's gift and his call are irrevocable. In other words, what God promises, he always honors. Besides from the various explanations Paul provides in Romans chapter 11, he has already on more than 3 occasions specifically denied and shown the error of replacement theology. Since the Jewish race, Jerusalem, and the land of Israel have so many prophecies remaining to be fulfilled, one would certainly expect them to play a major role in God establishing His eternal kingdom on the earth. Simply put, the parables of Jesus speaks of separation, not complete rejection. It complements both prophecy and the eternal covenant God had given to Abraham and his descendants, represented by the Jewish race. Don't be fooled by the dangers of this doctrine of replacement theology. As a Christian, if you have been saved by God's grace, you should be looking forward to our Jewish brothers and sisters in having their scales removed and turning their hearts to Jesus in a miraculous way. Did the Old Testament prophet Zechariah not prophesy the Lord as saying, "I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and pleas for mercy, so that when they look on me, on whom they have pierced, they shall mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and weep bitterly over him as one weeps over a firstborn."